Hello there and welcome back to Digital Foundry. The wait is finally over. PlayStation 5 Pro is here and we're now able to present our full review. Well, as full as it can be, as we've had less than a week of hands-on time with the unit. So usually I handle the hardware reviews at Digital Foundry, but for this one we're going parallel. Three of us are combining our impressions and our testing to bring you what we hope will be the best possible review we're capable of in the time frame. So joining me first of all, John Linneman. Hello.
Hey, good to be here, Rich. Yes, we've been spending a lot of time with the PS5 Pro, still capturing. Our very own Audie Surley is here behind me, capturing more Spider-Man for upcoming videos as well. So there's going to be a lot happening over these next few days.
All resources are being deployed, which brings us to Oliver Mackenzie. Hello.
Yes, Rich, the next few days and indeed possibly the next few months, we'll be very busy with PS5 Pro content, I suspect.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let's just get straight into it. Let's talk first of all about hardware. Impressions. What do we make of the console? Now, John and I shared some initial impressions in the epoch-making unboxing video that we did. And, generally, I think the takeaway was that it's a very well-built, decent console. It's much smaller than we thought. 3.1 kilograms. It's lighter than the launch model by a considerable degree. I'm actually quite taken with it. I think it's pretty good, and I can't comment on the thermals without ripping it apart and inserting probes, etc. But it's just as quiet as any other PlayStation 5. John, what do you think?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I was, as you saw from the unboxing, I was taken aback, surprised, I would say, by the size. The size reduction compared to the base model. I think it's a more attractive looking unit, and I think that actually goes a long way. But at the same time, it also feels very familiar once you actually get going, right? You slap the disk drive on there, as I did. That process, this was my first time doing that process. It went fairly smoothly, I would say.
Yeah.
Although it required a firmware update before I could actually do so.
Yes.
So it went through all that initially, get it hooked up, and then it just behaves exactly like a normal PlayStation 5. And this is actually kind of an interesting point because that was one of the big differences between the 5 and the 4 Pro. Because with the 4 Pro, you instantly got that 4K UI, and the whole user experience felt tailored for this new machine. But obviously, we're already in the age of 4K, so you don't get that. And as a result, it just feels like a continuation of the PS5. But still, as you said, the hardware itself is nice. The ports, everything on it is well located. I feel like it's a solid machine overall based on these first few days with it.
Yeah, the optical drive does have the online requirement as well. We've got some capture of that here.
Yes.
A bit unfortunate. I still think that the Pro, being a Pro model, and the fact that it's appealing to the core enthusiast who's probably been with PlayStation for years, should have had a physical drive in the box.
And I want to note, Rich, real quick on that. I was looking for games that are PS5 Pro enhanced, like Motorfest, The Crew, Lords of the Fallen and such. And I was like, oh, maybe I'll grab those real quick. The prices on the store are still $79.99 for Lords of the Fallen, $69.99 for The Crew Motorfest. I instead found copies online for $15 a piece. So it's just an illustration of why it's not just about collecting or preservation or anything like that. It is a price thing. And yes, there are sales sometimes. Exactly. If there's no competition in that space, that's not good for your wallet. And I think that's definitely a situation here where if you're a new PS5 Pro owner, you can't find the disk drive, you don't have the disk drive, you're going to be getting raked over the coals.
Right. Okay. Oliver, let's talk about your impressions of the unit.
Yeah, it's surprisingly not that large. Even though I've seen the hardware before, it was still a little bit surprising to me. It's just a little bit larger than a PS5 Slim model. It's smaller than a PS5 launch model by quite a margin, I would say. And it's quite light as well, like you mentioned. Quite similar looking to a Slim machine. I kind of wish they'd done a little bit more to differentiate it. Maybe a different color for the faceplates, maybe a bit more of a break, or maybe like a spike or something bold, right? Between those two faceplates. They've done that kind of 3-stripe design, but it's not that distinctive, I would say. Even the PS5, or rather the PS4 Pro, I think was a bit more distinctive in its physical characteristics with that kind of 3-layer sandwich as opposed to the 2-layer sandwich of the base PS4 unit there. But, with respect to that PS4 Pro, that unit had a bit of a reputation for being very loud, especially as it matured. And here, I noticed when I powered the unit on, it was very, very quiet. The heat that came out of it was of a similar character in terms of its hotness to a regular PS5 console. And I think that probably the overall design is pretty well designed here, and I suspect it will probably age pretty well because the PS5s that I've had have aged quite well as well. So I think this will probably be a console that continues to be relatively quiet, continues to be pretty well behaved under load, at least over the lifespan of the console, I would suspect, based on what we've seen so far with the PS5's design.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, so let's move on. We're going to go a bit deeper now. I want to talk about the HDMI controller on the PlayStation 5 Pro because, John, there's problems with the HDMI controller on the base PlayStation 5, 32 gigabits per second bandwidth, which basically means that you can't get 120 hertz output at 444 or RGB, right? It's chroma subsampling down to 422, right?
That's correct. And yeah, for those unclear with chroma subsampling, you're essentially processing the different colors at a different resolution. So you lose some fidelity. It's actually very difficult to spot during normal games. It's most obvious if you load up something like a very fine per pixel image, like a computer desktop or small text with a lot of detail in it. Then you can actually see some of that fringing and a little bit of noise and artifacting around things. We had hoped that the PS5 Pro would essentially conquer this because, as we know, it now supports 8K output, which you'll get to in a moment there, Rich.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the 4K 120 mode is still limited to 422. So even if there have been changes made, it does not address this fundamental limitation, and we're still limited to 32 gigabits per second, it seems, as a result, when in 120 hertz mode.
Okay, so here's the thing, right? 8K output requires essentially twice the bandwidth of 4K at 120 hertz. So the display controller has got to be upgraded, right? That's just pure logic. So we kind of think it is, but not in the way you might expect. So we've got capture here of a PS5 Pro attached to an 8K screen. Now, looking at the signal types supported, we've got 8K there or 4320p. But looking at 4K, 120 hertz is still limited to 422. So now connecting the Pro to my 8K capture card, the Pro isn't having it. The menus say I need both 60 hertz support, which I have got, but also DSC, which my capture card hasn't got. DSC is display stream compression. So theory crafting time here, but I think Sony has added compression support to the display controller, but it's likely still limited to 32 gigabits per second of bandwidth. I guess the good thing is that display stream compression is lossless, to the best of my knowledge, so there's no loss of quality. And actually on an 8K supported screen, you will get full resolution 8K RGB support at 60 hertz with HDR. But as there are no capture devices I'm aware of right now that support DSC, we can't show you 8K at the moment. That was the problem we had when we went to visit Codemasters for the F1 opportunity a few weeks back, which is quite interesting. 8K, John, still not interested, right?
Not currently. I mean, I think what that fundamentally means is that everything's going to be scaled, barring these few random examples. And I'm not into that, even with a pixel density like that, which would help a lot. You're still going to be relying on upscaling, which introduces some additional blur to the final output unless you do a nearest neighbor scale. And, I also don't want any additional processing on top of that. And like you said, there are fewer 8K displays now than there were in 2020, I would say.
How did you work that out?
Well, at least from certain lineups. For instance, LG used to offer more 8K displays, right? They've kind of rolled that back. They had these top-end 8K OLEDs even, and there's just less of this stuff now. Basically, if you go to your local display store and browse around, you'll find that where once there was many 8K screens on display in sort of a showcase fashion, there's now just 4K larger screens. They're pushing up towards 100 inches and beyond now, which is interesting. Yeah. But I think it's just, we've realized that 8K, it's just, at the moment, a bridge too far in terms of delivering content, right?
Also, I mean, I think from Sony's perspective, even though they're shipping an 8K console, the world's first 8K console, in fact, which you'd think would be a point of some marketing triumphalism, you know?
Or at least
first
a
8K
label on the
console.
box.
Right.
Well, exactly. They don't have a label on the box, so they don't really seem to want to tell people it's an 8K console. Maybe they're worried that people with 4K displays will think, oh, this isn't the console for me, or something. But just to speak to John's point, I think Samsung is the only TV manufacturer that is now shipping 8K panels every single year.
I think you're right.
Other manufacturers, like, you know, the top-end LGs, the top-end Sonys, they're all, whether you're talking about LCDs, whether you're talking about OLEDs, they're all 4K sets this year in 2024. I think they were all 4K sets as well in 2023. So it really, you'd have to go back a couple of years to find like 8K Sonys, 8K LGs. And like for my purposes, yeah, they are getting cheaper, but like I looked at the QN900D, which is an 8K version of the QN90D that I have back there. I was considering buying it, possibly, when I got that panel, but it costs more than 3 times as much as the QN90D in the same size. And also, the panel is worse in some respects. It only does 1400 nits peak brightness, not 2100 nits as my QN90D. So for my eyes, my light-loving eyes, you know, 2100 is a lot better than 1400. So for sure, for me, it's like, well, you spend 3 times as much. Most of the time, you're getting probably a worse image because it's scaled, and you're getting a worse panel possibly as well. So it just seems like kind of a raw deal.
And frankly, at that pixel density, unless you're way over 100 inches, I feel like the difference is extremely difficult to appreciate.
Your eye can't really resolve it too
like
well.
in a PC situation, more so because you sit very close. But watching a TV from and even a close viewing distance, your eye can't resolve that detail.
Yeah.
Which is perhaps the point. It's like the whole retina display concept, right? This whole thing of like, there's so many pixels that you can no longer distinguish the pixels is what they're going for.
Yeah.
But still, not really.
I've said it before, but to me, 8K basically represents really good anti-aliasing as opposed to, you know, a massive boost to core image quality. And it's good anti-aliasing when viewed at a distance. I did see the F1 game playing out at 8K, and it's fine on static menus and stuff, and it's fine in game when the movement isn't really a thing, but in motion there is breakup because it is, you know, a TAAU upscale from 4K. It's a technical curiosity. It's a nice to have, but it's not a defining feature of the professional, I don't think. Okay, let's move on. We've just been talking about the menus. The menus also include a PlayStation 4 image enhancement feature. Now, we didn't really know what that was before we actually went hands-on with the unit. We were thinking maybe it's just like, okay, extra horsepower means better image quality and dynamic resolution scaling games, but that's not the case. It is a feature that's toggleable on the menu, and it does actually do something quite interesting. Now, Oliver, you're going to be doing a full video on this, but how about some cliff notes on your observations?
Yes, I'll give you the rundown here. So essentially, you boot up your PS5 Pro, go into that display settings menu. There's an option to enhance image quality for PS4 games. It says enhance image quality in the settings for PS4 games. It's turned on by default. So if you boot into PS4 software, you'll kind of figure out what's going on pretty quickly, I think, if you turn the setting on and off, which is that you see quite a noticeable difference in the appearance of those games. If you look at 2D elements like UI and text, they actually look quite 4K now. Text is a lot sharper. 3D content is also altered considerably, like in a game like Destiny, where the aliasing artifacts in the original have been smoothed a little bit. The lines look clear. The image almost looks like it has anti-aliasing that's being performed in a 4K pixel grid, so it kind of aligns with a 4K pixel grid there. So it looks a bit cleaner. But when you do resolution counts, you quickly realize, like, okay, this is a filter because the base game content is still being rendered at the same resolution. You're not getting any kind of additional grunt there. You're really getting a post-process filter, it appears like. The issue is that it doesn't really do anything for temporal aliasing, given that it's probably working on a single frame as input. As a post-process, it gets tripped up pretty easily by post-processing. So if you have like chromatic aberration, it doesn't really know what to do with that. If you have film grain, like I played The Order, and it just doesn't really know what to do with it, so it doesn't do too much, it seems like, because there's film grain all over the image. It also doesn't seem to apply to games that output above 1080p. So like in Overwatch 2, for instance, that's a 1080p game, but the UI is 4K. It doesn't apply at all. So I think it's a good idea. I think it's cool. I have done some comparisons that I'll go into in a standalone video with LS1, which is a lossless scaling machine learning algorithm. I've also done some comparisons with FSR, with the RTX super resolution that's available on NVIDIA GPUs. And it is kind of comparable to those solutions, I would say. It's giving you a better image in a lot of respects. It can give you a noticeable improvement, but it's not going to be a game-changing improvement. It's not going to be like the LSS or PSSR for that matter, or FSR2 or any of these other solutions that can do so much with so many more inputs, obviously, than a simple post-process filter could glean from a PS4 software. So I think it's a cool idea, but at the moment, it's kind of a nice-to-have feature. Don't buy a PS5 Pro for this. So basically the takeaway. But it's nice. It's nice to have it. It's nice to see Sony caring about this stuff. And I think it is kind of cool for these older PS4 titles in particular, where they can't take advantage of PS5 Pro very well normally, right? That we can go back and we can maybe get a post-process enhancement that could run on the GPU there. That could be nice.
Cool. John, you gave it a go as well, right?
Yeah, a couple thoughts I have. I really like what it does for 2D elements, like user interface, text, fonts. It makes them genuinely look like there is additional detail being resolved. It's not just like an upscale with sharpening. There is actually some additional detail there, which is really nice. But along those lines, I also tested Pixar games because I was a little bit concerned that it might interfere with the image quality there, and thankfully it does not. Cool. It actually it actually works well. For 1080p pixel art games, normally the PS5 would upscale it to 4K based on your output, and you would just get kind of a softer scale, right? So it makes the pixel art look a little bit softer than it probably should. With this feature enabled, it actually makes it look noticeably correctly scaled and sharpened without really adding noticeable artifacts to it, which is what I was worried about, given the different direction that they go with that kind of art. So that's a positive as well.
Okay,
so 3D stuff, though, it's like you said, Oliver, not game-changing, but interesting.
Yeah, like for instance, in Bloodborne, which is a game that has a ton of chromatic aberration and lots of aliasing, it kind of doesn't do much for the 3D content. But you look at the UI in Bloodborne, and it's like, wow, this is like almost 4K native UI. Like it looks really good, and it is creating detail in that text in particular that you would not see with like something like FSR1. It's quite compelling in that instance. But it's kind of, some games it's compelling, other games it's not. Most of the time it's like nice to have, but not essential to have, essentially.
Exactly.
Okay, well, I'm going to look forward to your full video on that one, Oliver. But let's move on. Okay then, so one of the key features of PlayStation 5 Professional is the fact that your existing PlayStation 5 games should in theory run better thanks to the Game Boost feature. So I had the pleasure of testing Game Boost, which we can now confirm deploys the full power or something close to it of the PlayStation 5 Pro to non-pro games. They run faster, and we all know which game we had to test first, Elden Ring. I'm using the quality mode here, which runs at a fixed 4K with fixed quality settings. Both of those elements are kind of dynamic in the performance mode, but we'll get onto that shortly. Quality mode. So this is good for like comparisons to get some sort of grip on the performance differential. So here's the thing. You won't get a locked 60 frames per second on PlayStation 5 in PlayStation 5 Pro, rather, in quality mode. But you should comfortably remain within the 48 to 60 FPS VRR window for most play. Looking at the comparisons here, I've added real-time performance differentials expressed as percentages. But when the game does run at 60, obviously the GPU is underutilized, so the percentage will be lower. It's in areas of gameplay where the Pro is under 60 that you should see how much extra performance the Pro gives. Seems to max out at around 35%, a typical 30 to 35% delta. So yeah, not a locked 60 in quality mode. However, then I tested the frame rate mode, dynamic resolution, dynamic features. It should be locked to 60 easily, but it's not. So I'm guessing possibly the game's DRS system doesn't quite know what to do with the horsepower. There's also the possibility that we're CPU limited in some respect. Even so, VRR will smooth this out. So the Pro, still the best place to play on consoles, even if it's not everything we want it to be. You gave this a go, didn't you, John?
Yeah, because this is a game that I played through on Xbox Series X. That was previously the best place to play it because of the wider VRR window, but obviously it regularly falls into the 40s. The PS5 Pro essentially solves that completely. As you say, performance mode in my testing was able to stay well in the VRR range pretty much all the time. So it's very smooth. And that's the mode I use on Xbox. And that PS5 also gets per object motion blur, which looks really good, which the Xbox version doesn't seem to use in that mode for some reason. And then what surprised me was that the quality mode is actually very usable now, and that runs better than performance mode on Xbox. And you get it now mostly stays in the VRR window, not 100% as your values show, but it's close, and it's usually in the 50s, and it's a noticeable boost in sort of like clarity, and it's still fluid. So I thought that was a huge improvement in my experience, and I kind of want to dig back into it because I did not play the DLC yet. But that means I gotta kind of start over and play through on PS5. I bought a physical copy in Japan and gonna go through it. So let's do it.
Cool. I also did some tests against the PC version at quality mode settings equivalence, basically, or as close as we could get to it, up against the PS5 and the PS5 Pro. So fixed 4K there. Fixed settings. I'm using an RX 6800 here, as many believe it offers pro level performance. The thing is, though, the 6800, there are PC style stutters throughout, but in terms of actual gameplay, it's way, way, way smoother. So I'm going to be interested to do more sort of quality comparisons, performance comparisons between various PC parts and the Pro based on real world performance. Right now, all of the sort of conjecture about the performance of the PlayStation 5 Pro has been based on Sony's statement that it's 45% faster, but certainly Game Boost, it rarely gets there. I was also curious about ray tracing support on the Pro and whether Game Boost taps into the extra features, because the Pro has extra RT features, right? I was curious if the backwards compatibility would kick in with those features, similar to the way it does on a PC, but I don't think it does. So I'm using control in photo mode here, which unlocks frame rate, and of course, we have returned to the corridor of doom. The first comparison seems to offer a performance boost in the region of about 31%, kind of similar to the Elden Ring boosts. The following scene, again from the corridor of doom, 33% boost overall. Also did a couple of scenes outside the corridor, which are lighter. The Pro can run faster, still similar differentials overall, 33%. So back compat can't tie into the extra RT features of the Pro as far as I know. It just taps into the raw performance. Yeah, so that's quite interesting. I mean, it's great, but it has its limitations. But I think there's genuine application in the 120 hertz mode. Devil May Cry here, special edition. You can unlock the game to run in 120 hertz mode. I'm using, first of all, graphics mode with ray tracing, which essentially removes the 60 FPS limit, so we always have that differential there. I tried the intro in graphics mode. Very similar performance increases overall, but there are some instances where it does seem to go higher than that 35% threshold. Maybe it's the sampling rate on my performance comparisons there, which is higher in 120 hertz mode, but who knows. In performance mode, though, still with RT enabled, the differentials can go higher. But I think the key point here really is that with VRR performance RT mode, you're just getting a better high frame rate gameplay experience. I think you'd agree with that, right, John?
Absolutely, yeah. I think this is really important too, because this is one of those weird games that never received a PC update, right? It's only Devil May Cry 5 Standard Edition on PC without the ray tracing. And because of the performance demands of this game, DMC5 SE was never really possible to really enjoy the ray tracing mode, I felt. You had to settle for not a great frame rate if you wanted decent looking ray tracing. Finally, it feels like it runs the way you would expect. And I found the quality mode with ray tracing in VR to be absolutely excellent as a result. It stays pretty much above 60 by and large, and it just feels responsive and it looks great. And it's kind of become like the best looking way to play DMC5 now, which, by the way, it's still a stunning looking game.
Oliver, do you have any thoughts on Game Boost? Did you give it a go?
I did give Game Boost a go, and the first protocol for me was Metaphor Fantasio, because that game kind of infamously does not run at anything like a stable frame rate on PlayStation 5 consoles, on Xbox Series consoles, basically on anything almost. It runs at 1656p and it's like 40 to 60 FPS-ish on PS5. It's not a good experience. Totally like unlocked frame rate. It also has a 120 hertz mode, which again does not work well because the game dips even below the VRR window on PlayStation 5 quite frequently. I speculated in my video last month that PS5 Pro would basically fix it. And lo and behold, it has. It's basically a locked 60 FPS now. It's a very smooth experience, even in areas where the base console was really struggling. In spots, at the worst I saw was in a spot where the base console was like 44 FPS, 43 FPS. PS5 Pro was like 55, 56, 57. And that's like a pretty extreme scenario. So even without VRR, this game is totally saved. Great experience. And this is like probably the most challenged recent release I've seen on the consoles in terms of hitting a consistent frame rate. And it is obviously a very popular game now. Lots of people are playing it. And I think it's just about perfect now on PS5 Pro. So if you get the most powerful console in the world, you can have a game that looks about 10 years out of date running at a stable 60 FPS on a console. If you spend $700 on a console, that's pretty extraordinary. I also tried out a couple other games. One other game I tried out was FF16, which ran unlocked in its performance mode most of the time, much of the time, except in combat. John covered that, obviously. Weird behavior there. I did not play too much, but Pro unfortunately does not deliver a locked 60 FPS. It's like in the 50s a lot. I think there, what might be happening is the dynamic res is just kicking in and it's not load balancing in a way that we would like, probably, because it does have a dynamic resolution system. So it's kind of like there are some positives here, big positives with the boost potentially. And it does apply, by the way, to all games. There's no way to turn it off. It's just always using the whole GPU. That's important to note. There's no like PS4 Pro style game enhancement might break your games. In this case, they're just applying it to all games, it seems like. I think that even though it isn't like a gigantic improvement in some titles, because of dynamic res, because of VRR and lots of titles with unlocked modes, because of the occasional odd title like Metaphor Fantasio that's just like running in a slightly messed up manner, I think that there are probably a lot of examples here, and we're probably just scratching the surface a little bit of what can be done with this. But yeah, I think there are a lot of games probably that will get decent enhancements from Game Boost, and that will really help people with like big libraries play older titles, that especially that might have VRR modes, those unlocked VRR modes in lots of games. They don't run so well necessarily on base PS5. Maybe they'll run quite a bit better on PS5 Pro.
I have a few more to chime in as well here very briefly. Silent Hill 2 benefits that may receive a patch, actually, I'm not sure, but that essentially eliminates the stuttering issues that I noticed. It smooths out both performance and quality mode. So performance mode is now mostly 60 with a couple of little dips here and there, but VRR smooths that out, but it's very close. The 30 FPS mode on base PS4 actually had a lot of slowdown, which was extremely shocking. Anytime you would be attacked by certain enemies, and that is also eliminated, as well as the running around stutters that it suffered from. It's just a lot more consistent. Silent Hill, the short message, that little hexadrive free Silent Hill experience, also fixed now, runs at 60 FPS properly, whereas before it was extremely unstable. So that's a huge improvement there. Suicide Squad I randomly tested, and I didn't spend too much time with it, but it seemed to, those sort of skips and stutters and dips that I saw in the city have largely been cleaned up, but maybe they're also cleaned up on the base system, but it definitely felt better in my experience. Then there's three others to quickly mention. Ghostwire Tokyo, it gets much closer, but not locked to by any means the 120 hertz output. So you can play that game in 120 hertz mode, and it actually allows the frame rate to be uncapped. And in the quality mode now, you're getting mostly north of 60. And the performance mode is north of 100, I believe. So it is noticeably smoother, which is interesting. But it still has some weird little like hiccups and stutters, which the game has always suffered from. So it did not fully fix it, but it is smoother. Armored Core 6 as well. This was a From Software joint. It ran better than Elden Ring ever did, but it still had dips on actual... on the regular PS5. It's cleaned up in my experience. That was my game of the year when it came out last year, I guess. And it's freaking awesome. And now it's actually quite a bit better on PS5. Lastly, GT7's patch hasn't launched yet, and I decided to try it out. And what was interesting about this now is you can run it at native 4K mode in the 120 hertz mode, and now it achieves a completely locked 120 FPS playback in native 4K mode, which previously it was in like the 80 to 90 FPS range with the uncapped VRR mode. Now it's just flat 120. You also get 120 FPS replays, which Excellent. There can be tiny little dips here and there, but like I've never seen replays this smooth in GT before. So it's quite a treat. And weirdly, I would assume that these options might go away once it's patched. So right. We'll see what happens.
I think my sort of final takeaway is that you do seem to be getting the full power of the PlayStation 5 Professional deployed on older games. But that does raise the question of the 45% extra raster performance, because I don't think you're getting that level. Question is whether that applies to pro level games or whether there's some restrictions in place that apply to game boost. So maybe you're not getting the full performance level. I think ultimately, if you look at your base PlayStation 5, increase the frame rate in GPU limited situations, we'll talk about CPU limited a bit later, then apply that 30% to the frame rate number you have, and that's pretty much what the Pro will give you. And if it gets you to 60, great, but it's not a given. Not every game is going to get to 60. But I'd say it's certainly a very, very interesting feature nonetheless. Something I didn't have time to test that much. You would expect games that are locked at a particular target performance level, 30 or 60, but are using dynamic resolution. You would expect the image quality to be cleaned up. I tried it on Metro Exodus, actually. I didn't actually see a massive difference there, but, mileage will vary on a title-to-title basis. But more to come on Game Boost. We want to check it out with some other titles. But let's move on. Okay, so now we're going to move on to actual game performance and what the new features of the PlayStation 5 Professional mean for all of that. And we're going to kick off with the element that's probably most contentious about it, which is the fact that the CPU isn't really changed at all from the base PlayStation 5. This is slightly problematic because we have found a number of games where there are CPU limitations. I'm going to quickly cycle back to Game Boost first of all, because there's actually a mode on PlayStation 5 Pro where developers can actually opt in to having 10% extra CPU clock. And that comes at the expense of a little bit of GPU performance. So I tested it in Cyberpunk 2077, which hasn't been patched, but this is the classic Cherry Blossom Marketplace run. It's not quite fully synchronized here, but you can definitely see what's happening. Running around that marketplace in a circle, the frame rate dips beneath 60 frames per second, and the dip is considerably more pronounced on the base model. Still not quite 60 on the Pro model, though, but you can look at the performance differentials there, and it's exactly in line with what you would expect from an extra 10% of CPU clock. So we can confirm that Game Boost isn't just boosting graphics performance. You are getting that 10% of extra CPU clock. The other test I did, and this one is for a Pro enhanced game, and that is Baldur's Gate 3, the classic city run. Act 3, we've got a save that's like 100 hours in, and we can actually do a run through the city. And you can see that on the left there, the base PlayStation 5. On the right is the Pro enhanced version of the game. We're still CPU limited, and you'll see that similar to Cyberpunk, the performance differentials are again in line with a modest bump to CPU clock. So, Oliver, I think this is probably the primary limitation. I mean, a lot of people are looking at PlayStation 5 Pro thinking, should I give up my PC or should I stick with PlayStation and not move to PC? And I think the defining limitation of the Pro, which we've got to accept, is that even mainstream CPU performance now in the PC space is significantly better than the Zen 2 in the PlayStation 5 Pro. So you've kind of got to accept that limitation with the Pro, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is a mid-gen refresh console, so the emphasis is obviously not on some of those more kind of fundamental areas of the console design, I would say, like the CPU. But here, I mean, right now, high-end PC CPUs are about twice as fast as the PlayStation 5 Pro's CPU. But I think what we're seeing in most titles nowadays that target console hardware is that basically they are mostly delivering 60 FPS. Like, I don't think we're in quite a cataclysm of games that are failing to hit their performance targets on console. I think most games are basically there, plus or minus some stutters and issues like that. But obviously in titles like Baldur's Gate, obviously in some more CPU limited games like you mentioned with Cyberpunk in certain areas, you do run into some problems, and there the PS5 Pro will not save you. It might be good for an extra 10% of performance, but it's not going to. It's not going to save your performance. It's not going to be that kind of generational leap in CPU performance that would actually fix those problems. Yeah. But the 10% is nice. I mean, it's nice to have something at least.
Absolutely. Games that are slightly off their performance targets due to CPU limits will see a boost there. And, I honestly think that you should be running a VRR capable display if you can afford a $700 console. Okay, let's move on. Another aspect of the PlayStation 5 Professional that is one of the key selling points, I guess, there's the big three, right? And one of those big three is enhanced ray tracing support. John, you've been looking at some games, and ray tracing support has indeed been enhanced on a range of titles. What caught your eye?
Well, obviously, the first ones I wanted to check out was the Insomniac group. I'm actually working on a full video for that, so I don't want to go into too much detail here, but Spider-Man 2 is the one that received the most. And I think what I found is that the improvements are nice, but relatively subtle. And it feels like you can tell that the game wasn't necessarily arted up with this in mind from the beginning, but essentially it means things like, for instance, what they call the key light shadows. It's actually the sun shadows. It simply allows distant buildings and structures to properly cast shadows on themselves, which previously you didn't get at a distance. There's also improved RTAO, which, as expected, adds occlusion shadows in spots where there previously were none, or where it was more generalized and kind of fuzzy with the solution they had in place. So that's more accurate. There's also a screen space GI pass, which I will show in more detail in the video. It's a minor thing, but it's there. This feels like Insomniac essentially like going back and adding some additional things that are kind of cool, but they don't radically alter the game's visuals. When we get to the PSSR stuff, perhaps there's a little bit more to say, because I think that's more effective in terms of what it does to the image quality.
Yeah,
overall.
Absolutely.
But there's other games as well, right, that have RT. And I think Oliver's played some of them as well. One of them I wanted to note, because this is a weird one. So it's Dragon's Dogma 2, right? This one has all sorts of weirdness going on, and we got to figure out how we're going to talk in more detail about this. But in the daytime, the RT with PSSR enabled has like a weird splotchiness to it. It feels very unstable in a way. I think you mentioned this in your impressions before, Oliver, where it doesn't look quite right.
Anytime you move the camera, you just kind of create these huge patchy holes in the RTGI.
Right.
It's most obvious in the performance PSSR mode, but it is present across all the PSSR modes. And I checked this against the game on PS5 here, and it's not nearly as apparent there. There is some lag to the RTGI, but it's not nearly as apparent as with PSSR. But the upside, I guess, of this, if you can call it that, is if you do want to turn off RT, it completely disappears, this issue. But it's really distracting. I think it's kind of broken looking. I pointed it out to the Capcom reps when I was looking at it 2 months ago, and I said, this is not right? And they kind of looked at me like I was speaking Spanish. So I don't know if it'll get fixed, but it is an issue still in this launch code, unfortunately. And it is annoying, I would say.
Agreed.
Any other games you want to bring up, Oliver? You've looked at Alan Wake quickly, haven't you? That's got a 30 FPS RT mode.
I have looked at Alan Wake. Alan Wake gets RT reflections in its quality mode. They look really excellent. They add a lot of depth to the game. They fix a lot of issues with SSR that can be really unflattering when SSR is off screen, or even when it's on screen, because it has a kind of grain to it on PlayStation 5 and other consoles that I do not like too much. It's probably the effect from the PC version, the RT effect, that makes the biggest impact on the visuals. So it's nice to see it on Pro. They're bringing over the most impactful piece of RT tech over to the consoles there. In terms of other games, I played a little bit of F1 24, like we saw from Tom's preview and from my impressions at the PlayStation event a couple months ago. They're getting RTAO and RT reflections on top of DDGI, adding a ton of lighting detail into the game that would probably be very expensive on base PS5. Only compromises image quality, not perfect. It does look very 4K-like, but there is some breakup in it, especially on like fine geometric elements with subpixel detail like fences and things like that. Not perfect, but still a pretty good upgrade overall, adding 2 RT effects on top of the PlayStation 5 feature set there. Also in Hogwarts Legacy, unfortunately, Hogwarts Legacy's patch is not live. When I played it a couple months ago, it was quite good, but I do want to see more of that when it does get the final patch there.
Same with GT7.
There's also GT7, of course. Yeah, GT7, we don't have the patch yet, but it should look quite compelling, I think. But there are some that are a little bit less successful, like in Veilguard, where they add RTAO to the performance mode, which doesn't add too much to the visuals, I think, and it also has some negative impacts on image quality that we can discuss a little bit later. But it seems to push performance, in particular, down below 60 FPS quite often, which I think is a byproduct of the CPU cost, which Alex noted, I believe, in his impressions, that on an RX, on a 3600 rather, that it would potentially drop below 60 FPS with some of those RT features enabled. So I think that's possibly what we're seeing there, which is not a super positive development relative to the base console. But I think the early results are really promising. I think Formula One is a highlight. I think Hogwarts Legacy will probably be a highlight. I think the Insomniac games are cool, what they're doing there. I think that probably with the PS5 Pro, like, you might get 1 or 2 more ray traced effects above PlayStation 5. And I think that's a pretty cool thing. I think that's pretty cool. And possibly developers could do more extensive things with it in the future. But so far, I think from like F1, we can see developers can really push out ray tracing on the console. Just that we need more developers to follow in their lead, I suppose.
Yeah, I was really impressed with F1, to be honest. The feature set that they've got in there is really impressive. The performance is good as well. Some other notes about F1 I'll talk about later, particularly when it comes to power draw, which is quite amusing. But I think my takeaway from this is that third-party wise, we're kind of seeing effects that are present on PC kind of being ported across to PlayStation 5 Pro, which is a good thing. But I'm really looking forward to the time where maybe the first-party studios are actually targeting the hardware specifically. Everything we've seen from Sony thus far is essentially retrofits, right? And I'm looking forward to seeing what they actually do when they're specifically targeting the Pro. Right, okay, let's move on. Let's talk about PSSR, the AI-based upscaling solution. I'm not sure how much we can actually add to the coverage we've already done with Ratchet & Clank and The Last of Us Part 2. That was during the pre-release period. But I guess we have now played more games. We have now got more impressions. And I think it's fair to say that similar to what we've seen with DLSS and FSR2 on PC, the success of PSSR basically changes the success level, the quality level, if you like, changes on an implementation based basis from one title to the next. John, got any notes about PSSR in the games you've tested?
Oh boy, do I, Rich. There are some huge improvements here. FF7 Rebirth is arguably the largest one, but we'll get to that. But the one that surprised me that hasn't been talked about yet is Stellar Blade. Right. I love Stellar Blade, but its original display modes have what I would say is relatively poor TAA implementation, with a lot of noise, shimmering, sparkle. If you just stand still and look at the image, you actually see this noise in motion, and it does not look good. And I talked about this in my original video. Only the balanced mode was okay, but even that was somewhat noisy. So for the PS5 Pro patch, they've actually added 2 modes. One of them I think is very strange. The other one is amazing. So the amazing one uses PSSR instead of the prior TAA solution. And it also unlocks a high frame rate mode, which relies on VRR. And this one's that's a little bit weird because it does switch to 120 hertz output, but it seems to essentially cap itself at 80 frames per second, which they specify in their update text is like, you can enjoy it at 80 frames per second. So the game runs at 80 FPS then with VRR then. So it does feel noticeably smoother. It's just, I feel like it could possibly go higher. Cutscenes, though, are always limited to 60, so they come back down. But either way, 60, 80, it is very nice looking now on a good screen. That is for sure. And if you're not on a VR screen, you just get 60 FPS, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, PSSR, though, my goodness, it completely changes the image, and it just resolves so much more detail and cleans up so much noise, and it winds up massively improving the visuals overall, I would say. In what was a somewhat dirty looking game at times, it makes it look super smooth and clean, and it is a gigantic leap. It's probably the best implementation I've seen yet, just in terms of improving overall image quality, maybe, and stability. Stability is key. It's temporally stable now, whereas before it was not. Which is why the Pro Max mode, as they call it, taking one from Apple perhaps, is so strange. That one, with high frame rate mode engaged anyway, limits itself to 50 frames per second. And the way they describe this is essentially, this is the original version's quality mode, which was kept at 30 frames per second, but now it runs at 50 frames per second. But it does not use PSSR. It uses the original TAA, but it's native 4K. But the thing is that even though it's a lower internal res, the PSSR mode looks significantly better than the native 4K image with TAA.
Wow.
Like, it really is. It just, the detail, the resolution, everything, the way, the temporal stability, it's all improved. Which is why I feel like the Pro Max mode ends up being kind of useless, because I think the image quality is technically worse, even if the resolution is higher, and it's capped at 50 frames per second if you're on HFR. Otherwise, it's just the 30 FPS quality mode on a non-VR 120 hertz screen. So there's weirdness there, but if you can use, I recommend the normal Pro mode with PSSR. That's a game changer. Just like it was, we've talked about this before with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Again, seeing more areas in that, it makes such a difference. It is so much sharper and cleaner than the original version, and it runs very smooth now. I feel like even with the visual flaws the game has, it just feels much more coherent now, because the muddy, smeary look of the game originally kind of just made the assets that didn't look good, it made them look a lot worse. And it did not elevate the good assets.
You fixated on them a bit.
Right. Yeah. You fixated on them. That's all gone now. And it just feels so much better as a result. So I really want to play through the game now, because it makes a difference. Another one, though, that I wanted to mention is actually Demon Souls, the remake from Bluepoint, which, again, in its original state, they had a 1440p mode at 60 and a native 4K mode at 30. And I think the PSSR mode, which is 60 FPS, looks better than both. You maybe get a little additional detail resolved in the native 4K mode, but there's much more, there's more stair-stepping aliasing within the surfaces, and just more visual noise. Like, it's less effective as a TAA. The TAA is less effective in that original 4K 30 mode. And as a result, the new PSSR mode, it's so much more temporally stable, and it resolves more detail in a way that I find much cleaner and more visually nice. I also discovered, I haven't played this game since launch. I loaded up my, I did a New Game Plus on my finished save, and boy, the New Game Plus mode or whatever, the second round is extremely hard. It is way, way harder than the normal game. Wow. So I didn't get that far in this, because I only have this save here available. So it's that first area again, getting creamed by these enemies. But man, it sure looks good while it's happening.
Let's talk about a game that doesn't use PSSR but has insanely good image quality. Horizon Forbidden West, and I assume the Horizon Zero Dawn remaster as well. Yep. Oliver, you've had a lot of great things to say about that based on your time at the event, right? But John, you've now spent some time with it on your home setup. What do you think?
I think they might have achieved arguably just about the best image quality I've seen in a console game.
Really?
It's so good. When you consider the density of the visuals, how much detail is in them, the way it resolves that detail and presents it is so clean and attractive that it's honestly mind-boggling. It looks really, really good. It feels like you're playing a high-end PC game now, using everything that you could throw at it from the PC side. That's the upgrade I feel here. It's stunning, and there's so much granular detail in the distance, the grass, the rocks, everything. It does not, I mean, the game is very visually busy, right? And this just does it justice in a way that the original modes did not, especially the original performance mode and even the updated performance mode. It's light years beyond that. And yeah, I would say of all the titles we tested, this is the one that has the best image quality overall. There is weirdly still a quality mode that also uses this, and it is slightly better, I guess, but I really don't feel like it's necessary. The performance one is extremely close.
Gorilla told me all that does is like increase the dynamic res internally a little bit, but they also said that friends don't let friends play at 30 hertz.
Good. So they know now, yeah.
Yeah, they know. I mean, the closest analog to me is something like DLSS, where the image is just like in games with good DLSS 2 implementations. It's just super smooth, super stable, handling varied content very well. Horizon is a game with quite challenging, I think, content possibly for these upscaling solutions. Has a lot of foliage, has hair, has a lot of complex movement when you're doing combat and stuff like that. Everything I threw at it, perfect. Just like looked awesome. Foliage looked great. Like the old, I thought the old checkerboard mostly looked fine, but again, you go back to that and you look at the foliage and it's like, no, it's not nearly as good as this.
Big upgrade.
It's a huge
upgrade. I thought it looked fine until I saw DLSS on the PC version, and side by side, lower resolutions via DLSS are looking better than the checkerboard solution on the PS5, but it looks as though that's been supremely addressed with this upgrade for the PlayStation 5 Pro here. Very, very good stuff.
I also just wanted to mention, because I did my own testing on PSSR, quite a bit of testing on PSSR, going through a bunch of games, a bit of a gauntlet of games. And yeah, I would say Horizon for sure is the peak of image quality on PlayStation 5 Professional at the moment, but that is not using PSSR. So I tried to do a deep dive into some of these other games. And I tested FF7R quite a bit, and I agree with John that is like definitely up there. I did not play Stellar Blade, unfortunately, but I think FF7R, that is a really impressive improvement there. Part of it is because the improvement in detail is quite outrageous, but also because it's delivering a very crisp, very sharp 4K image out of a base resolution that's like not super high. So it's like 1152p, 1224p-ish internally. It's doing that in the game with a pretty zoomed out third-person camera, a lot of action, and it's giving you a perfect rendition of action scenes with a lot of complex movement and particles. But it's not perfect, I would say. You can have some problems with specular aliasing. It can blur patches of foliage when you're just walking by. It can have some issues with foliage where it kind of appears overly noisy. Even on opaque edges, it's not 100% stable. It's not as stable as the old 4K mode in the graphics mode on the PlayStation 5 console. But it is a huge improvement. It is absolutely a huge improvement, and it is absolutely one of the best titles in that respect on PlayStation 5. Ratchet and Spider-Man, we've already covered a fair bit of Ratchet in particular. Those games look quite good. Again, higher internal rendering resolutions, look a little bit softer, some artifacting. Again, we've covered that. T-Loop Part 1 and 2, again, look great. A little bit more artifacting than their fidelity modes, but again, look pretty good. But then there are a few games where PSSR is not doing such a good job at the moment, and I wanted to bring these up. There are a couple that I did note, actually 3 that I noted, but we've already talked about Dragon's Dogma 2, and that game has some somewhat unique issues with reconstruction at the moment. One of them is Dragon Age the Veilguard. So in the performance mode, the grass in this shot just shimmers like crazy. They've added RTAO, which I suspect doesn't help. The internal resolution here is about 864p internally. That's what I counted it. Going up to roughly 1440p, it looks like in that performance mode, because it's not nearly as sharp as the fidelity mode is in this title. It's resolving quite poorly, and in motion, you get a lot of edges that are aliased, a lot of edges that look low resolution. There are some visual bugs as well, where the grass will pop out of existence for one frame and then come back the next, which is an odd issue that kept popping up. I hope they do take the time to fix that. Hopefully this is just, pre-release teething issues. SSR also has a lot of issues with a lot of flickering. and the water. It's a very different looking SSR there, so it does not look very good. The old FSR2 Resolve did look a bit softer in motion, but it handled the foliage better, I would say. It handled the foliage quite a bit better. Okay. In the fidelity mode, there are some issues, but it looks a lot better than the performance mode. The other example of a game that I think is not quite there, and I will cover this in more detail, is Alan Wake 2. It can look very noisy in stills. Almost like you have a kind of film grain on, but you don't have film grain on. But it's just very, very noisy, like in stills, like I have here. It's an issue in both the performance mode and the quality mode. PSSR, on the upside, PSSR definitely handles complex movement better than FSR2. Disocclusion is much less of an issue, but that noise is annoying. And it doesn't clean up a lot of the shimmer and aliasing during movement. Like a lot of the problems that we saw in FSR2 are still problems with PSSR in this title. You're still seeing that breakup. You're still seeing that aliasing. But one thing I will note in this title as a kind of PSA to anyone who is playing on PS5 Pro is that some of the game's image quality issues seem to stem from the fact that the game appears to be using lower res post-processing. So I wouldn't normally recommend this, but if you turn motion blur off in the settings, the appearance of aliasing in motion can be diminished quite a bit with motion blur off, especially on like fine specular highlights, little subpixel details. It can be improved quite a bit. So I would recommend that possibly, especially in the performance mode where I don't really think that that motion blur is adding a lot, but it is actually giving you a lot of extra aliasing, which is weird. I also noticed the same behavior on the base PS5 with the FSR2 Resolve there, but it was a little bit less of an issue in that title with FSR2. I think with PSSR, it is a bit more noticeable. So maybe turn off motion blur here, especially in that performance mode. The other thing I wanted to note with Alan Wake 2, which is a bit unfortunate, is that the performance in that 60 FPS mode, it wasn't perfect on PS5. It was pretty good. There were some sections that caused issues. On PS5 Pro, the performance is worse. In the forest area in particular, you're running in like the upper 40s, low 50s at points. It's not amazing. I'd hope that they could improve that as well. That is unfortunate to see a performance regression there. Again, they have improved a lot of visual settings from what I can tell, like a lot of the shadow settings. You can definitely notice that things have been bumped up there as well. Yeah, that could be improved. So I think, to me, PSSR at the moment, I think it depends a lot on the game engine, the internal resolution, the output resolution, the presence of transparencies and how they're presented to PSSR potentially, the presence of ray tracing. I suspect that we're going to see a bit of a divergence in the quality of implementations possibly. There might be some minimum threshold of resolution that's wise to clear with the technique at the moment, at least. And I think what I'm seeing broadly is that some of the third-party implementations are really good. Some are a little bit not as good, especially at lower input resolutions. And the Sony first-party stuff is universally good, all good, basically, to, pretty great. In the case of FF7R, which is not Sony first-party, but, is a closely developed game, I have to imagine. So that's my impression at the moment. PSSR, I think it's a good technique. I think it's doing a lot of good stuff in a lot of titles, but for sure, like some of these early implementations in those 3 games I highlighted, I would like to see some work done there to improve those for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good stuff. Let's move on. Before we talk about our final sort of verdict on the PlayStation 5 Pro, let's talk about power consumption, power testing. Okay, so we've got some new visualizations here. For the first time, we're able to map power consumption into our performance graphs, thanks to an assist from our valued contributor Illusion. It's worth saying that the polling of the power meter is like 1 sample per second, so it's not particularly granular, but it gives you the lie of the land in terms of power consumption. So initially, I tried Elden Ring in RT mode, which we didn't test earlier. A couple of takeaways here. First of all, my launch PlayStation 5 remarkably actually consumes less power than my Slim, even though the Slim has a 6nm processor. That is kind of bizarre, but it came up in every single test. Now, every console will have different levels of power consumption according to the quality of the silicon. So I must assume that my silicon's SoC quality just isn't particularly good. Second takeaway is that the performance improvement on the Pro in RT mode is highly variable, sometimes not much better than the base models at all. So I'm pretty sure that's a CPU bottleneck, and power consumption therefore is only indicative of when the Pro is CPU limited, right? So, that was pretty inconclusive. So I retested in quality mode in Elden Ring, which will be far more likely to be GPU limited. Much wider performance differential this time, but it's still quite amazing to see that the Pro is consuming around the same level of power as my Slim. And the launch model is actually producing lower power consumption levels there. But for the Pro to be in the same sort of ballpark as the Slim, it's highly indicative that they're on different process nodes here, possibly 4 nanometer for the Pro, which is something we didn't expect going into this, owing to the low GPU frequencies, but it does seem to be the case. I next looked at Spider-Man 2, which has a bespoke Pro implementation next, so you'd expect the hardware to be taxed a bit more. However, the differentials here are quite similar to the Elden Ring quality mode test. Power consumption, very, very similar to my Slim, but as I said, I think my Slim's power draw is much higher than it should be, bearing in mind the launch model results there. Even so, flattering comparisons there against the launch model. So it looks, based on the Spider-Man test at least, it looks like the Pro consumes around 230 watts then, which is pretty impressive for the performance you're getting. Must surely confirm a more modern process technology for the SoC versus the Slim. But 230 watts isn't the limit, I don't think. So earlier I talked about F124. In the quality mode there, which really pushes the ray tracing features hard, remember, uses dynamic resolution scaling to really push the GPU to max utilization. Power there was in the 230 odd watts level, but it actually peaked at 240 watts, which may seem to be indicative of a system limit there. One thing I do want to point out is that my launch and my Slim PlayStation 5s have the optical drive attached, which I don't think adds that much to the power draw when it's not being used. However, to ensure parity with the results, the Pro also had the optical drive attached there as well. So pretty efficient piece of kit, I'd say, bearing in mind it's not drawing that much more power than my Slim. But then again, my Slim seems to be drawing more power than it should be. Compared to the launch model, though, that's an awful lot of extra performance you're getting for not that much more power. So I think, overall, pretty good stuff. Any comments, Oliver?
Yeah. It's pretty impressive there in terms of that power consumption. I was expecting like maybe 300 watts or above if it was indeed a 6 nanometer chip, but I suppose the size of the console, the weight of the console, and the very low power consumption of the console, it's got to be on a miniaturized process, I'd have to think. I think what we're seeing with the PlayStation 5 2, the PlayStation 5 Pro rather, is you do see a little bit of that dynamic clock rate in there where even though the game load is varying a lot, the power is staying within a pretty consistent window of like 10 to 20-ish watts on that spread there. Mm-hmm. Whereas on like the Series X, I've noted from other commenters who have tested that and who have tested the new Series X 6 nanometer revision, there are big differences in power consumption between games. So on the PlayStation 5 and PlayStation 5 Pro units, you should get a pretty consistent power consumption difference there, or power consumption usage there between titles. And like you said, Rich, there is a bit of a silicon lottery to this. So it's hard to say if this is 100% representative of all units. You might have a bit of a bum Slim unit, for instance. So there is probably going to be some variance between units in terms of how much power they need to expend to hit those kind of system clocks that are specified by the system based on load.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, John, in terms of the sort of quality of life experience, if you like, there's nothing sort of crazy about the PlayStation 5 Pro. It's not belching out tons of heat or anything like that. It's a really quite efficient box, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I feel that. We're at the point now where if you think back to last gen, there was always these concerns over things like fan noise and the heat output. You get the jet engine going, right? There's a lot of those original Pros, very, very loud. I feel like console noise and heat output has largely become less of an issue. And I'm happy that the Pro essentially continues this. It's a very quiet, reasonably cool running machine. I have it shoved down in my cabinet as well and have been sort of monitoring the temperatures there. And it feels completely within specifications, shall we say, which I'm happy with. It's a nice machine in that regard.
Mhm. I think from my perspective, the only mystery is that if you are going down to a more modern process node, I'm kind of curious as to why CPU and GPU frequencies aren't really that much different to the original launch model. That's a bit of a mystery. Maybe we'll get some detail on that in due course. But the end result is that it is relatively efficient, I'd say, for the performance that you're getting. And
Yep.
when you're looking at those power consumption metrics, in Game Boost, for example, with Elden Ring, you're getting a lot more performance for not much more power draw, which I think is a bit of a win. Okay,
Absolutely.
let's move on to final impressions, final verdict, so to speak. We can't get away from the fact that the PlayStation 5 Pro is an expensive piece of kit. It's $700 US, £700 in the UK. Prices seem to ratchet up even more in Europe, I think partly because of the VAT side of things.
Europe and Japan are real bad.
Yep. And then you've basically, if you are invested in the physical media, which a lot of the audience are going to be, bearing in mind, who it's targeted at, you've basically got to buy that $80 optical drive. It's £100 in the UK, which is remarkable.
120 in Europe.
And then there's the whole concept of the stand that I paid £25 for. Yeah, it's expensive. But John, I would like your impressions first. Do you think this is like a luxury item? What's your takeaway here?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I mean, clearly, when you look at the price point, yes, it is a luxury item for sure. More so than the PS4 Pro, I think, which was priced to essentially replace the base PS4, right? That's not the case here. And it becomes even worse. You mentioned the disk drive MSRPs, but good luck getting one at the MSRP right now. They are exceptionally pricey online as a result of low stock. So I hope Sony can resolve that quickly enough. But there are things about it that are a little like, people loved in the unboxing the way you tore open that packaging like Hulk, right? It was funny, if a bit excessive. Problem is like for a product that costs north of 500 in every region at this price level, I really feel like they let people down in terms of the packaging. It doesn't really matter for the overall product, but like you expect something a little bit more premium, right? Like you can still have that Apple-like experience. I mean, Microsoft does it with the Xbox Series X, I would say, which feels very premium when you open that box. Like just having that flimsy cardboard sleeve and this like artery slicing the cardboard in there. It's very cheaply put together. And I don't buy sustainability arguments because Microsoft's packaging is also sustainable. They could have done better there. But ultimately, that's just that initial user experience, the first consumer moment of truth, as they say. And then when you get to the product itself, it's targeted towards people like us, I think, right? We have an eye for this stuff. We do appreciate those details. We notice them. I think there is definitely going to be a subset of people that will not be able to spot differences. There's not going to be anything major where they'll be like, wow, this is a huge upgrade. It's more like it has some nice improvements, but not game-changing improvements. But also it's like it kind of fixes problems in certain other games as well. So it's like a way to improve games that maybe had issues in the past, like Elden Ring. Which is you can't really sell a product on that, but that is a thing that it does, which is nice. So I like it. I think it's a nice machine. I would want this either way, because I do play a lot of console games still. I think they've made some strange decisions with like the disk drive not being included by default. It lives up to that pro name, I guess. If you feel like you are actually a console professional, as we are, then yeah, that's probably a good thing to go for. But if you're somebody that's not like super tuned into these things and don't really notice a lot of these flaws, or if you're using a much smaller or older TV and you sit further away from it, I think that also influences things where you probably won't be able to see it. But if you're like me using a fairly big TV, I think Rich and I were both using 77-inch now. and I sit rather close to it, so the benefit is extremely obvious to me. But yeah, those are the kinds of questions you need to think about.
Okay. Before I go to you, Oliver, I just want to say, John, that ripped cardboard recycles just as well as intact cardboard. And I don't need the box of my PS5 Pro. I'm not going to sell it or anything. I'm not going to repackage it and put it into storage. It's going to be used. It's not the sort of packaging, as you say, it's not high quality packaging that you want to keep forever. No, it's disposable.
Actually, there is one more point I want to mention for the betterment of the audience is the experience of getting the system and transferring your stuff over. If you do the system transfer, it is long, but there's a nice thing here that we have to mention. Actually, two nice things. If you take out the NVMe drive, if you installed an additional NVMe drive in your PS5, you can just transfer that to the Pro, and it will work.
Cool.
You don't need to re-download everything. The only caveat there is if you plug in your new PS5 Pro, start to download some games, then power it off, and then put the drive in there, and there's a duplicate, it will delete those duplicates from the NVMe, the ones that are already being installed or partially installed on the main system. So I recommend doing that switch right away, and they will just appear in your game catalog, which is awesome. Lastly, there's the battery. There's the CMOS. I guess it's like a CMOS. It's the little dime battery, right? Mm-hmm. There was all the talk about the activation and things and needing to replace batteries in consoles with like the PS4 and the PS3, right? It's inevitably something that's going to happen with the PS5 years in advance. When the system has no battery, it seems like you can't activate and play digital games, which is a problem. So you need the battery, right? Well, they actually made the battery very usable, user serviceable now. There's a little port under one of the plates, just like the NVMe drive, where you can pop it right out. So good thing to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to come to you now, Oliver, for your final impressions, but I do know that directly after the playtest you did at Sony HQ, I asked you exactly the same question. and I'm guessing that your opinion probably hasn't changed that much.
Probably not. No, I basically have the same opinion, which is that I think it's very compelling hardware. I think that a lot of the mix that you'd want out of a more advanced console, possibly even a next-gen console, is here, in terms of an improvement in RT capability that's big, machine learning capability, obviously faster raster performance. It's improving where it matters for a mid-gen refresh model. That's especially important here because there's kind of an open mandate for developers in terms of what they do. If they add PSSR, if they add ray tracing, if they improve resolution, it's not like PS4 Pro where the target was squarely on high-res displays. That's also kind of here with 8K, although I expect 8K will be a fairly marginal feature. Not a lot of games will support it, I suspect personally. It's going to be much more about like these settings improvements and image quality improvements that you might get from PSSR and things like this, more interesting things that developers will hopefully do with the console. At the same time, I think the early software, there's some really strong efforts from Sony in particular, from Square Enix. There's some very strong stuff there where you're basically getting 4K 60 performance modes, subjectively speaking, good-looking 4K 60 performance modes with PSSR in a lot of titles. In Horizon without PSSR, but incredible image quality there. You're getting really, really high-quality software that is taking advantage of the console in a good way, especially for early efforts. But there are also some games that aren't faring so well. Obviously, we talked about Dragon Age, we talked about Dragon's Dogma, we talked about Alan Wake a little bit in some image quality aspects, at least in Alan Wake. So I do think that developers maybe need to get to grips with the hardware a bit more. Maybe target resolutions might need to change. Output resolutions might need to change. Things like this, visual features might need to change in terms of what developers are targeting for their pro modes as well. But overall, I like new console hardware. And the PS5 Pro is very bold and interesting new console hardware, breaking some new ground and creating a new class of experiences, importantly, above PS5, above Series X, something that's going to give you the best experience on consoles in all likelihood for most software. And I'm looking forward to covering it. I'm looking forward to seeing what developers do with it. It should be fun to untangle what developers are doing on the Pro here. And it's going to deliver hopefully a pretty high-end experience for console users. So yeah, I do think that if you want a better PS5, if you have a bit of money to spare, I think the experiences today perhaps aren't necessarily what you're buying it for. It's the experiences in the future and the experiences that we see it can deliver in titles like F124, in titles like GT7, in titles like Horizon Forbidden West, in titles like The Last of Us, in titles like Ratchet and Clank, in titles like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. It's those games that you're looking out for. And there, I think you're going to see more software like that in the future. You're going to see more compelling experiences, and you're going to see some value out of that unit that you might buy today. And you might get a pretty compelling experience out of it. I think that's where you're going to be with the PS5 Pro.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my sort of final thoughts on this are pretty straightforward. If you look at the concept of paying more for more features and more performance, it's basically the standard sort of thing on PC, right? Nobody's really having discussions there saying, I can't really tell the difference between my 4070 and my 4060 because, it's quantifiably different. The PlayStation 5 Pro is quantifiably different and quantifiably better than the standard PlayStation 5. The issue here is that developers are actually specifically targeting that standard model to get a good experience. So basically, it comes down to this. Standard PlayStation 5, a good experience. And that good experience would be good for probably the majority of the market. Maybe the majority of the market still have 1080p screens. We don't have that visibility at the moment. We don't have that telemetry that the platform holders do. But even a 4K screen at longer distance, it's still going to be great. The PlayStation 5 is still a really good console, as is the Xbox Series X. That doesn't change. So you have good with the base unit, and then you have better with the Pro. And if you look at the sales split of the PS4 Pro and the PS4, it was like, I think it was like 80-20. And so there are 20% of the audience that want a better console. And I suspect it's going to be exactly the same thing for the PlayStation 5 Pro. There'll be a minority of users that want to pay more to get more. And this applies to all levels of consumer electronics. I mean, I've got a Samsung Galaxy S24 Ultra. I don't really need one because, cheaper phones would do most of the same job. But, I had the funds to spare. I wanted the better performance and the better features, so I paid for it. And that's exactly what the PlayStation 5 Pro is doing. What I will say is that the concept of a $700 console, in terms of expanding the audience, it's going to do nothing, I don't think. I don't think that's going to change anything there. And then, of course, going forward, if the idea is that, cutting edge silicon, you need to pay more for it, where does that leave the next generation of consoles? That is a bit of a challenge. That is problematic, I think. And I'm going to be really interested to see how the traditional console manufacturers, Sony, Microsoft, even Nintendo, handle that. But right now, you have got this problem of a $700 console, and I think that's, possibly not an issue when you're talking about a niche product. But, moving into the mainstream with the next generation, I don't think you can put out a console for $700. But that's a problem that, the platform holders are going to have to deal with in a few years' time. For right now, as I said, you've got good with a $500 console. I guess it will get discounted in Black Friday. And you've got better with the Pro as a $700 console. If you can tell the difference, we've done a pretty good job of highlighting how the Pro improves matters. If you can tell the difference, if you have the funds, well, it's the best console available at the moment, I'd say. I don't think there's any real contesting of that. And that's what I think. So I think that's everything. I think that's the end of all of the discussion points we wanted to have in this review. So thanks for the two of you, first of all, for basically pooling resources here so we can get something out that's meaningful for the embargo, because I was never going to manage to do the vast volume of testing we've managed to do between the three of us. So thanks for that. And I hope you and the audience now have a really good understanding of what we think of the PlayStation 5 Pro, what its features are, what the performance boosts are. And hopefully that will inform your purchasing decision. But that's all from us on this one. As ever, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.